This episode of the Sustainability Scope was brought to you by AM Custom Clothing. If you need sustainable custom branded clothing for your business, band or brand, head to amcustomclothing.co.uk today.
Welcome to the Sustainability Scope with me, Alex.
And me, Mike.
The show that cuts through the noise about sustainability to help you make informed decisions, whether you're an individual or a business. So today, Mike, we're going to be talking about recycling.
We are.
So should we start with what recycling is? Do you want this definition?
I think so. I mean, I think everybody knows what recycling is, even if they can't give a big, proper academic sort of definition. Because we pretty much all do recycling, even if we're not the ones responsible for filling up those bins that we put out every week or 2 weeks or whatever our collection cycle is. So let's take a look at what the American Environmental Protection Agency says, seeing as they're probably somewhat authoritative on the matter. They say that recycling is the process of collecting and processing materials that would otherwise be thrown away as trash and turning them into new products. Recycling can benefit your community, the economy, and the environment. Now, there's some bold claims. So should we talk about whether they're actually legitimate claims or not?
Yeah. Let's dive into that. Should we look at each of those kind of claims?
Yeah, I mean,
and break it up.
What's the benefits of recycling then? Actually, I think the EPA did go into a little bit more detail. So one of the biggest focuses that they have in their literature is that recycling reduces the amount of energy that's required to produce something. So I could produce a sheet of paper by cutting down an entirely new tree and going through the process of breaking it down into tiny little fibers and squishing it back together again. Or I could take an existing piece of paper and breaking it down into its tiny little fibers and squishing it back together to make a new sheet. And essentially what they're saying is that whether you're doing that with paper, aluminium, plastic, etc., that the energy required to create something recycled is lower than the energy required to make something from scratch.
Yeah, and as well as energy, that is the water, the raw resources, all of it's less than if you were going from scratch.
Yeah, and I don't think there's too much debate about that. I think that's pretty kind of, there's a consensus there that within reason, there are obviously edge cases, etc., but within reason, that's pretty agreed on. The economy and the environment. I mean, the environment we obviously know about. We just talked about the energy consumptions. The economy, it's a little bit harder to kind of define, isn't it? But I guess it's probably, again, there's probably enough consensus there. There's money in recycling. There's a huge industry evolved around it. It's going to be cheaper for most businesses to make something from recycled material rather than from scratch because there's fewer energy resources required to go into it.
Yeah, so it's benefiting both sides, isn't it? You got the job creation in the industry as well as the actual businesses using that industry. So everyone's it makes sense. It makes sense economically as well.
Everyone's a winner. Everyone's a winner. No, I thought something quite interesting because I think probably both within your lifetime and mine, here in the UK at least, both our no matter where you lived, the councils will have gone from just collecting sort of big rubbish bags once a week and lobbing them in the back of a truck, taking them off to stick in a hole somewhere, to making you sort of have about 4 bins that you all had to sort through and put them into different things. That was something that was kind of brought in within our lifetimes, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's progressed massively. So it's gone from you used to get the big plastic boxes, didn't you? And then it's evolved into actual purpose-built wheelie bins that are different colours, which is a nice. It's better.
Unfortunately, depending on where you live, some people never had those boxes. I know both you and I did. That's one that we'll probably come on to that a little bit later, but that's one downside to the whole thing, is that there's no uniform agreed way of dealing with things. Everyone's kind of come up with their own solutions, and that may or may not be the right way. but there's definitely no single approach to take into recycling. But what I found quite interesting was that despite the fact that recycling became a bit of a fad, it's become a lot more popular, a lot more fashionable, sort of within the last sort of 20 years or so. It's not new, not by any stretch of the imagination. And when we were doing a little bit of digging before we started recording, I found that the first recorded instance of paper recycling was apparently during the period of decline of the Japanese imperial court, where paper production moved away from state control as workers gradually merged into common society. As a result, private estate owners built paper mills and hired those workers to continue making paper, and then they began reusing the waste paper to create new ones. So that was in 1031 AD, according to Hinton Waste. And metal recycling became quite common back in 1776, apparently, in New York, where shortly after the British left America, for reasons beyond the scope of this podcast, they started tearing down statues of King George III, and they used the metal from those statues to create bullets.
That's mad, isn't it? That's mad.
I know. Also, according to Hinton Waste, that one. But it goes beyond that, though, doesn't it? Because if you think back, sort of depending on how old you are, your parents, grandparents, great grandparents of when they were in sort of World War II, they would have been talking about, there was the phrase, there was make, do, and mend. So you didn't sort of, oh no, I've got a hole in my sock, I need to throw them out and get some new ones. They'd find ways of making it work, whether that be recycling a previous pair, or taking a bit off it, attaching it, reusing other things, putting the sock to use for something else, just lots of things. So it isn't new by any stretch of the imagination. It's just become a bit more of an industry, I think.
Yeah, even like I remember seeing recently someone using cotton to make paper, and that's a process that's been going for like 2,000 years that had been done, and yet now it's like a selling point, it's made from scraps of cotton, but that used to just be the process, which is really interesting how what was the process has just
fun little side fact there.
Go
when I was a kid, I actually made some paper out of cotton.
I
think we went to where was it? I think it was Cheddar Gorge, somewhere around Cheddar. I think that I think there's a cave that's called Wookie Hole or something like that, and they had like this.
Sounds pretty shady, doesn't it? Wookie Hole.
It does. I mean, I mean, I haven't been for probably, I don't know, 20, 25 years, something like that. But it seemed like a good day out from memory. And I'm pretty sure it's there anyway. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was there. And they had like towards the end of the sort of journey around, they had this like paper mill, and they showed you how they used to make paper out of cotton, and you had to like dunk your hands into this like tank of stuff, and you had like a bit like you were panning for gold almost, and you'd like shake off the stuff, and it was quite fun as a kid, but not new.
No, it makes sense. It's quite funny. Like on that note, I was trying to convince my wife to go on for our paper wedding anniversary to go to a paper mill. That did not fly. We're not going to a paper mill. But
I'm surprised. I'm shocked.
Yeah.
But anyway, we've gone off down a little bit of a tangent there. So let's talk about, how does recycling actually work? How do I take my piece of plastic, my plastic bottle, or my glass jar, or something like that? How do I turn that into something new? It starts for us, for you, I, and Joe consumer. We stick it in a bin and we put it outside, don't we? And then we don't really think about it after that.
Yep, the collection process. So I guess it's 3 steps, isn't there? The collection, then it goes off to a mystery location that we don't normally know about, where it gets processed. So that's a case of sorting through it, put similar things together. So I don't know, you've got all the yellow plastics together, all the red ones together, and whatever it may be, all the glass together, and then the final step in this very simplified version is the remanufacturing into a new product.
Yeah, and obviously the process depends on the material. I think for the most part, it's relatively similar in the sense that it's sorting, break it into tiny pieces, and then remold it in some way. So with glass, according to WWF, they melt the glass down, they break it into tiny little pieces, and they might mix it with new raw materials. And then it all gets melted in a giant furnace and put into the molds of whatever it is you would be making your glass into. Very, very similar to how you would make glass if you were just doing it from scratch, but you're just adding in existing glass into the process. Whereas with paper, it's kind of similar, but it's not. You're obviously not setting fire to it at really high temperatures because that will make it burn. So it's similar to how I would have made that cotton paper many years ago, and you kind of just put it onto a sheet and after washing it and breaking it down and stuff like that. Whereas plastic's the biggest problem with recycling, isn't it? Because plastic is not just a uniform thing. It's not. Although we just call it plastic, there's like a million different types, and they can't all be treated in the same way. I pretty much always can't be treated together. They have to be done separately. So a lot of sorting is required, and there is big business in the sorting, isn't there? There's lots of machines that are using like technology to detect the different types by using cameras and various other things, probably lasers and stuff like that. And then, but it's again, it's once it's done, they kind of shred it into tiny little flakes and melt it and start again.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the other element is not always in those instances we've kind of spoken about something being melted down or made into the same thing again, but that's not always necessarily the case. I guess a little bit like with our paper example, cotton, it might be that you shred it and then make it into paper, or it might be that we've seen it made into buttons, before. Or it might even be something like textiles being shredded and then stuck into car seat filling. So it's not quite the same recycling process, but it's still a type of recycling in a way, just not quite as obvious.
It's just not being used for the same thing. I remember years ago I had a pencil that was made out of recycled money, which I quite enjoyed.
That's quite good.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be used for the same thing, just has to be used for something new.
Exactly.
So we talked about it a little bit already, but what materials can you recycle?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like just about everything, doesn't it? Especially when looking at the list that comes with the bins as to what you can recycle. It's like, well, all of it.
Yeah, I mean the US EPA, again, they put together a list. It feels a little bit their list is of the most commonly recycled things, but it seems a little bit kind of almost a bit elementary, their list. So they've got cardboard, paper, food boxes, which generally would be cardboard, mail, which would generally be paper. They call them beverage cans and food cans, so that's metal. Glass bottles, jars, which are glass and plastic, jugs, which I assume is going to be plastic, and then plastic bottles and caps. But if you think about the sorts of things that you and I can put in our recycling boxes and bins, batteries, clothes, oil, just about pretty much everything.
Yeah, and then there's things that you can't put in, like according to the EPA, bowling balls.
Yeah, I'd love to know the story. I'd love to know the story behind the fact that the EPA had to put bowling balls on the list of things that can't be recycled.
I feel like these must be a few things that they've seen a lot of, like you got garden hoses. I get garden hoses. It feels like more of a like understandable.
Yeah, it feels like plastic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So why wouldn't you put it in? But obviously we know why.
Yeah. So aerosols that aren't empty. Again, that makes sense.
Alongside propane tanks, because they could both be quite explosive.
Yeah, just absolutely. you'll be recycling the recycling plant. And then food and paper packaging that's soiled with food.
Yeah, but then you and I can put food in a special bin, can't we? But that's not, it's taken away like our recycling, but it's composted or burned rather than recycled. So you're not going to recycle an apple into a new apple.
Yeah, I read somewhere in regard to the food and paper packaging that's soiled with food, like that. It says heavily like soiled in the kind of UK guidelines. So it kind of warrants the question, like what is heavily? Is a pizza box that's got a bit of pizza grease in it, is that okay? Or is it that actually that would be too much? I don't know the answer to that.
No, I would assume a greasy pizza box would be okay. But yeah, I mean that kind of comes on to some of the problems that we're probably going to talk about in a little bit, in the sense that it's just a little bit vague.
Yeah. But I guess recycling is kind of part of a hierarchy of different tools, isn't it? So should we look into
it? It is. And I think because, again, coming back to that fashionable element of it, most of us kind of see recycling as this super tool to help us protect the environment. But it's actually
quite low down, isn't it?
Yeah, there's far better things you can do with the things that you might create as waste. And somebody somewhere has created what they call the waste hierarchy. Now, here in the UK, DEFRA, which is the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, they define the waste hierarchy as something that gives top priority to preventing waste in the first place. So depending on which image you go with, if you Google the waste hierarchy, you'll see it as a pyramid, but it will either be a pyramid as the one you sort of imagine in Egypt with the point at the top, or it might be an upside down pyramid with the point at the bottom, depending on how academic and creative someone's feeling when they put together their little graphic. Regardless, prevention is always at the top. So what they mean by prevention is making sure that you don't create the waste in the first place, because no matter what you do with waste, it requires energy to create it in the first place, and it will most likely require energy to do something with afterwards. So if you don't make it, you haven't used the energy. Just common sense, really, I think, isn't it? I don't think that's really should be coming too much of a surprise to anyone.
Exactly.
Then next in DEFRA's list is what they've described as preparing for reuse. Most people, when they look at the waste hierarchy, will just call it reusing. So that's, say, for example, if you think about what you would do at home, that is taking the glass jar of Nutella, washing it out, and using it to store herbs, spices, beans, whatever. So you haven't had to buy a new jar, especially to store your dried goods, and you haven't wasted one that's already been created. So you kind of gone.
No, I was going to say it's similar vibes with with like water bottles, like from the other side of it. Like if you have a water bottle that you use all the time, like a metal one, aluminium, perfect, because you can recycle that afterwards as well. But let's say you have a water bottle, like just have your own rather and carry that around, which again has become quite popular in recent times, hasn't it? Versus, you know, buying a plastic bottle of water. If you're carrying your own, again, you're kind of reusing it, but I guess that's worse than your Nutella jar, but better than buying your plastic bottle. It's that kind of middle ground between them.
Yeah, and it doesn't just apply to consumers either, does it? Because it can be used by businesses. So I remember when I was at school, my IT teacher would always have like a box of this scrap paper, basically, that he kept by the printer. And if you printed something that you no longer needed, and as long as it wasn't obviously like sensitive information, it went in the scrap paper box. And then when you wanted something to write on, but you weren't really that bothered about there being something written on the back, you used that. So that was great for taking notes and stuff like that. And it just meant that you used half the amount of paper that you would have used otherwise.
Yeah. No, lots of easy ways and easy like changes you can make to to do that. Even now, like I'm writing also on old paper that it was from something else, and I've ended up writing on the back of something. It's just so simple rather than getting out a new piece. And yeah, like with your jars, it's interesting. I've done similar, but with did you ever see the little mini Nutella jars that you used to get? I don't know if you still do.
Yeah, like in like a gift set, you mean, the really tiny
Yeah,
ones?
and it was like a pull lid rather than a screw one. They
Yeah.
make amazing glasses. So like I think I've got 4 glasses that are actually just Nutella jars previously in their previous life, now drinks glasses.
Yeah, I was just about to say glasses to drink out of. You haven't just got 2 Nutella jars strapped to your head to look out of.
No, drinks glasses definitely, but they look quite good as well,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I mean, I've used, because I've ended up with too many mugs, so I use mugs to, like one on your desk to put your pens and stuff in, rather than buying a new like a stationery holder thing. I mean, they're only small changes; they're not going to save the planet on their own, but it's just stuff like, they're just examples that are very, very general, and probably most businesses will come up with things that are applicable to their own processes. I mean, if you think about, from our own backgrounds, from clothing, there are manufacturers who take the scraps of off-cut cotton that have been sort of discarded in the manufacturing process, break them back down and reuse them for production of new garments.
Yeah, exactly. So lots of options there.
Yeah.
Hey?
So then obviously third on the list is recycling, which we've talked about a lot, and then what they call other recovery. So essentially that, for the most part, is using that waste material in some way to create energy. So that might be burning it, or something called anaerobic digestion. But it's essentially just in some ways it can create carbon emissions because you're burning it. In other senses, it won't, depending on what you're doing. And then the final one, which we want to avoid wherever we can, is landfill. Disposal, which is taking stuff to landfill, or burning it without energy recovery.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the other side of it with the energy recovery and other recovery. Like if you're going to be burning, like let's say raw materials, or like fossil fuels, you might as well be burning something that we need to get rid of. As it just, it's the lesser of the evils, isn't it? Still not ideal, but yeah.
And I mean, I think that's not even just about recycling, but that's one of the biggest problems with the whole environmental debate in general, is that we're all too busy letting perfect be the enemy of the good. There's the circular economy, which is talked about more so now. I think that's kind of come into common parlance within the last few years. And it's a bit of an extension of recycling, isn't it?
Yes, the European Parliament's definition is that the circular economy is a model of production and consumption which involves sharing, leasing, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials and products as long as possible. In this way, the life cycle of a product is extended, so not necessarily infinite, but extended.
That's quite an important one, because there is somewhat misconception amongst people, in the sense that they think that circular economy means literally that, going round and round and round in circles, when that isn't quite the case.
Yeah, it's not an infinite loop. So like in some instances, maybe it would be, but like plastic would be an example where it's not. There's only so many times before the polymers become weaker and it just doesn't work anymore. So you only get so many uses, whereas other materials are a lot better, and you can kind of keep going with them. Aluminium is a good example of that. You can keep reusing that.
You had a stat, I think we were talking about earlier. I don't think you've written it down in our notes, but I think, did you say something like 75% of all the world's aluminium that has ever been created is still in existence?
Yes, I believe that was it. I can't remember what the source was. It was a rogue website, so I don't know that.
Right, that's why you didn't include it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's
okay.
It's written somewhere.
It's written somewhere. I mean, there is a lot of aluminium that still exists that was created a long time ago, but it may or may not be 75%.
Exactly. And I guess this comes back to our like water bottles. They're a great example of something. You can reuse it with your water in it. And then once that bottle's been absolutely trashed, you can go and recycle it, and then it can be a bottle again, potentially a bottle again, and then the whole kind of chain starts again. And that's somewhat probably as good as the circular economy is going to get, where it's at that level.
Yeah.
An interesting case study I looked at actually before we started speaking was Adidas. I didn't realize they'd done this, but they created a shoe called the Ultra Boost Loop shoe, and they're made from just one material, that being thermoplastic polyurethane. So they don't use any glue or anything like that. It's just assembled in high temperatures. And because it's one material, the kind of theme is that it's not a shoe. I mean, you will own it, but their whole kind of marketing statement is that you'll never own the shoe because you return it once you're done with it, and then they just redo it all again, and someone else then gets the plastic from your shoe.
Interesting.
Yeah. Saves it going to landfill.
I mean,
essentially.
Yeah, I mean, technically you do own a shoe, but
yeah, technically. That's why I added that caveat of it being in their marketing as opposed to
unless you're paying them a monthly fee to rent their shoes, but that seems unlikely.
Yeah, exactly. Multiple people will own that shoe, or at least the polymers that are within it.
It's interesting. It's very cool.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about recycling in general. Shall we talk about some of the downsides? It's not really a downside, is it? But criticisms, limitations of recycling.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that comes to mind for me is what you touched on earlier, and that being the infrastructure differing depending on where you are. So what we're talking about now is possibly completely irrelevant to someone who's in another country, let's say, or even different parts of the UK, like even here. And it makes it confusing because I think a lot of times you're having to figure out what you can or cannot recycle. And I think if you're a busy, like, I don't know, single parent or something like that, I can see how you'd just not bother, because you've got enough going on, and you just be like, just stick it in the bin. It's not my problem.
Yeah, and I think the number of people that actually do that is actually very high. Both you and I have lived in apartments, haven't we? And I don't know what it was like where you were, but where I was, we had separate recycling bins, but there was a large number of people who just put whatever they want wherever they wanted. Sometimes not even in a bin, but when it was in a bin, it may not necessarily have been in the correct bin.
We had almost the opposite problem in the fact that everyone was very kind of, I guess, switched on to recycling, but there was more recycling waste than there was bin space. So again, you ended up with a lot of stuff not necessarily being recycled because there just wasn't the kind of infrastructure to cater for the volume of people wanting to recycle. Again,
that's a better problem to have, I guess.
Yeah. So you just find, like, especially I remember the cardboard bins. Honestly, it'd just be stacked on top of the bins.
Yeah. Which is probably okay if it's big cardboard, because the guys and girls that come and collect it can just kind of pick it up, lob it in, and then load the bin on top. But the issue is with if people aren't doing, or they were doing what they were doing in my apartments, they basically contaminate the whole lot, and then none of it can be recycled. So there might be 10 people who've correctly sorted and placed the stuff in the correct bins, and then because one person who either doesn't know, doesn't care, or both has come along and ruined it for everyone else.
Exactly. I guess another element to that and the infrastructure is the terms used. So last episode, I think it was, we spoke about biodegradable and compostable. Those terms, you might find people either putting things in the wrong places or not necessarily realizing that something needs to be done in a specialist way, and in turn thinking, I mean, maybe they don't necessarily do this, but maybe you'd chuck a biodegradable thing into a field because you think it's going to biodegrade, and actually it doesn't. I don't know whether anyone does that, to be honest. But yeah, as I say, a crude example of how it might end up not going to the right place as a byproduct of words that people don't necessarily understand.
There's in the UK, I don't know about elsewhere, but in the UK now, you can recycle the little sort of, like if you get a plastic container that comes in, I don't know, like a ready meal or something like that, where there's the solid sort of base part and then a film lid that goes on top. You used to have to throw away the film lids, but they can now be recycled. But the only place you can recycle them is at supermarkets. And if you do read the back of the packaging, it does say, so like plastic tray, widely recycled, and then film lid, it will either say something like not currently recyclable or recyclable at supermarkets or something to that effect. But if you're not reading the back of packaging, which I assume most people don't, then you might just think, oh, it's plastic, recycle a lot together. And then you contaminate the whole lot. And despite the fact that you've got good intentions, you end up just contaminating the whole lot and making all your efforts redundant. And there is a slogan, catchphrase, whatever you want to call it, that someone in the recycling industry, I remember saying a good few years ago now, and that is, if in doubt, leave it out. So if you're not sure what it is that you're going to be, whether it can be recycled or not, then just put it in the bin so you don't contaminate the rest of the stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, infrastructure, somewhat problematic. I think another element, less so on individuals, but more so on businesses, would be the associated costs with commercial recycling. If you want to recycle something, it's going to cost you money versus sticking it in a bin, which is free.
Well, ish.
To some degree.
Yeah, I mean, depending on where you are and how your infrastructure's set up, you still have to pay for waste, but more often than not, you will pay extra to recycle stuff in separate things, because you just got to have more vehicles, etc., to come in to get it. So unfortunately, companies that I've worked for in the past have tended, because they're smaller, they're not really environmentally focused. It's not necessarily a criticism, focused on making sure that they could keep their costs low so that they could keep the business running and the lights on, etc. They just have bins.
Yeah, at which point it's not. They're not being encouraged to do it, are they? It's not. If it's going to cost you less to do it the other way, and ultimately there is an economical factor in everything, then you're possibly going to go for that lower cost option.
Yeah, and another problem is that it has been reported numerous times by numerous people, either because they're wanting to raise the alarm or they're trying to make a particular point, shall we say, is that in many cases in the past and possibly the present, stuff that should have been recycled because it has been sorted by like just the general public, or people who were in good conscience thinking they were doing the right thing, put all their plastic in the right bins, etc. It's then just been loaded onto a container ship and shipped to another country. So I think in the past, I might be wrong, so I'm willing to be corrected, but I'm pretty sure in the past that's been China, it's been parts of Africa, and is now still parts of Asia. And it just gets unloaded, and I guess the intention from somebody somewhere is that that's where it will get sorted, because perhaps the labor's cheaper there or something like that. But more often than not, it either just goes to landfill in another country or just sits there with nothing happening to it.
Yeah, I think this is not only a problem from like a recycling perspective, but it's a huge problem from a trust perspective. As you type in like recycling and kind of elements related to recycling on the internet, there's so many articles that are like, oh, recycling's a myth, it all just gets shipped off. And I think it's going to be a huge deterrent, isn't it, from people who are doing it, if they believe that it's not actually going to the right place. So I think it's really it's much more damaging as a whole, not just because of the fact that it's in the wrong place.
No, exactly. And this is the perfect being the enemy of the good thing, because that just because one part of it, and I don't think it's exclusively plastic, but plastic is the biggest problem. Just because plastic is being handled in this way incorrectly, let's just clarify that it's being handled incorrectly. That's not why we separate our plastic, just so that it can be shipped around the world. But if it's been handled this way, but then paper, glass, metals are being recycled properly, as we expect them to be, then you should continue recycling, even if the plastic's being sorted stupidly and being shipped around the world. The rest of it's still being done properly. And at some point, if not already, there will be solutions for the plastic. So just because one part of an entire system is potentially broken, completely broken, or somewhat having some issues that need resolving, doesn't mean you should give up on the whole thing. But more so than that, it just means that it's more evidence of the fact that we should stop using plastic wherever we can by going back to the waste hierarchy, looking at prevention and reusing, because you can reuse some plastics, and using them for something else.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that's not to say we shouldn't. Obviously, people shouldn't not criticize this, and
No, you
the
absolutely
articles should be out there. So people I say people, so the agencies that are involved in this, are pressured into trying to do things properly. But I think you're right. It's about the awareness being there, but it not being a deterrent. And I think it's really hard to have both coexisting. But it needs to, doesn't it?
Exactly. But it's like saying there's a 1,000 people swimming in the sea every single day for an entire year, and on one day one person got attacked by a shark, and therefore we should never go swimming ever again. It's a little bit of a crude analogy, but I think it works. And absolutely, these things should be had a light shone on them, so that we can look at it, kind of bring it in the spotlight and talk about it, and put pressure, like you say, put pressure on the organizations responsible for it, and improve the way that we handle recycling in this way. It isn't a case of, here's a news article, oh look, you're all a bunch of hippies or whatever, you're talking about recycling, it's a total joke, you're wasting your time, you're being mugged off, give up, because that's not the solution. The solution is fix the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And then I guess again, to that note, it's the fact that plastics are confusing. You need to look out for the recycled logo, figuring out which type of recycling is applicable for it, which is kind of similar vein to what we were saying about the other products. It's knowing where you've got to put a particular product.
And again, the plastics are the worst for it, because I mean, there's the little recycling logo on them, isn't there, at the bottom somewhere on the plastic, or at the top or the side, wherever, and it's usually got a number inside it, or a letter, or both. I don't know what they mean. I know they mean something.
Yeah.
I always I look at it and I'm like, oh, that means something, and I just forget to do anything with it. I've got a kind of a good feel of what goes in and what doesn't into our recycling, but if I had to look it up, I couldn't tell you without looking it up. Sorry, I couldn't tell you what those numbers mean.
Yeah, exactly. You probably find you're the problem, Mike. You've been putting the wrong stuff in.
Very possibly.
No. And then the other side, which I guess to some degree goes back to circularity that we were speaking about before, and that's that some materials can only be recycled a few times, like plastic, before they kind of reach their end of life use. So it's worth just being aware of that. That it's not an infinite loop,
no,
which means it's not the holy grail. So if you can reuse or any of those other things higher up in that hierarchy, then that's a bit better. So I guess in summary, to
wrap it
recycling.
up.
Yeah.
The recycling is good. I think that's an undisputed argument. Is it perfect? No, but I think as is becoming quite clear in this podcast, the answer is never black and white. The answer is that we're kind of heading in a direction. It's never we're never going to arrive at the destination. We're always going to be working towards improvement, and that's recycling is absolutely one of those things. It's better to avoid creating the waste in the first place. Where you can't avoid creating it, try to reuse it. If you can't reuse it, then absolutely recycle it. And then there obviously are other options beyond recycling that aren't as good. Most things can be recycled, can't they? With that big asterisk that we've talked about over and over and over again here about plastic.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I think all in all, in summary, it's a positive, isn't it? Just need to keep doing it. Don't be deterred by the fact that there are some discrepancies, shall we call them, in the recycling world. And this is probably a nice segue into the sponsor of this podcast, AM Custom Clothing, who offer recycled clothing that is fully customizable with your logos or design. Additionally, they provide a clothing recycling service, so if you're done with your uniforms or teamwear, you can send it straight back to AM Custom Clothing and they'll recycle it for you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Scope. If you liked what you heard, then be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Follow us on social media too by searching the Sustainability Scope.